Welcome to ChinaPower. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I'm joined by Tom Shugart and Mike Dahm. Tom is an Adjunct Senior Fellow with the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. He served more than 25 years in the U.S. Navy as a submarine warfare officer, deploying multiple times to the Indo Pacific. Mike is a Senior Resident Fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and a lecturer at George Washington University. Mike served as a U.S. Navy intelligence officer for over 25 years. In this episode, we will discuss their new report, Flooding the Zone, the use of civilian landing craft, LCTs, in PLA Amphibious Operations. Tom and Mike, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Bonnie. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'd like to start with a teaser question for both of you. What have you found to be most interesting or most surprising when observing the Chinese military over the past year? And please don't say it's the LCTs or your report finding.
For starters, while it's not this report that we're going to talk about, I would say that one thing that Mike and I did happen to address in an earlier report, I know this is at the risk of log rolling, but it really was a surprise to me, was the revelation of China's construction of what we call Shuiqiao class landing platforms. So these are self-propelled, but they can combine together and form a multi-thousand foot long, essentially portable bridge system to be able to use Chinese civilian shipping to dock with them and send troops ashore. It was a surprise to see the revelation that they were under construction. And for me, at least, it was an even bigger surprise to see them, the way they connected them together to form one big, long bridge. That was a big surprise. That was almost a year ago, but it wasn't this year. And I'd say also more recently, there was a revelation that we don't know if it's 100% for real or not, but the apparent putting together by a Chinese shipyard of a kind of an auxiliary converted civilian ship being turned into a warship using containerized systems. The surprise here was not the idea of containerized missiles, but it looked like it had radars and gun turrets and defensive systems and a UAV with a truck-mounted catapult. I mean, it was really quite a surprise to see all that put together on one ship, almost like they're building a frigate or something, but using a civilian ship and container. So that to me was the two biggest surprises for the year.
I would say that I'm not sure I'm surprised by much anymore when it comes to the PLA, because I'm always looking back on the week's news or maybe, even over the last month. And I'm like, how did I miss that? Some headline that you just can't keep up with. There's just so much. But I think overall, and I was quoted in a couple of articles earlier in 2025, that we're looking at Chinese military infrastructure and some of the advances that were being made in military infrastructure. And I think that's an underreported thing. If I had more time in my day, I'd love to write some pieces about what we're seeing in terms of airfields being expanded, Navy bases and pier space being expanded, missile bases being improved and expanded. There's just a lot going on out there. And I think what I said at the time in that article was, or maybe I put it on social media, was if amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics, then it follows that those who study logistics would want to pay attention to infrastructure. And I think the PLA is building out a lot of military infrastructure to support potentially operations in 2027.
So Tom and Mike, one question for each of you on the teaser, and then we'll turn to your report. So Tom, for your key, surprising finding, the auxiliary container ship being equipped, how fast was that changing that, civilian ship to a warship? Are you seeing the Chinese demonstrate that they can do that really quickly?
So we don't know the exact time frame that it took for them to hook up, if they did hook up these, but at least to place these containers. The best imagery I could get was a few months apart. I'm really not sure exactly how long it would take, but what we do know is that it would take a lot less time than it takes to build a ship from scratch, which typically takes at least a couple of years for a ship that size. The angle that this potentially brings, I think, to things to be concerned about with China is, to me, the idea of strategic surprise, in the sense that it's pretty easy for us. If we're just counting gray-hulled ships, gray-hulled PLA Navy ships, it's fairly easy for even analysts in the open source world to have a decent idea of how many ships they're constructing. You can see them being built in shipyards, and it takes time. You can see that process happening. If China instead has a plan to, in a relatively short period of time, create these essentially auxiliary warships by using things that could be stored in warehouses, then there's the possibility that China could develop a system where we don't really know how many of these they could put into effect, put into use within a relatively short period of time, because the holes already exist in the form of China's immense merchant marine. And who knows how many of these, ship sets of systems they could have squirreled away in various warehouses.
Right. To your point, that makes calculating China's actual military capabilities much more difficult. Mike, over to you. In terms of your, interesting finding or interesting observation is how fast China's been expanding its military infrastructure. Are you seeing that pace actually increase over time, or has it been always at a pretty fast pace that's hard to measure if it's increasing or decreasing?
Well, I guess that would take some study. So if there's anybody out there with tens of thousands of dollars who would like to pay for such a study, I think Tom and I are standing by. Beyond that, it is difficult to tell. I think my point was just that we're seeing a lot of headlines about platforms, about the sort of sexy, oh, look, it's a sixth generation fighter. It's a new warship. It's a new aircraft carrier. It's a new toy. But those toys need a place to live. And I think the building out of the infrastructure is leading the way and a leading indicator of the things that are yet to come. And if we pay more attention to that, I think there has been just to answer your question directly, I think there has been an increase in the amount of infrastructure. The numbers of air bases have not substantially increased over the last year or two, but the numbers of taxiways, the ramp space, sometimes the numbers of runways is increasing. The numbers of Navy bases have not increased. But we're seeing more pier space being built in at Yulin and more pier space being built out at Yuchur in the Northern Theater. So, yeah, I think there has been an increase. But again, I know some folks in the imagery world, the commercial imagery world, that are working with AI and having AI look at images. And maybe that's a task for them to turn the AI loose on the imagery and see what kind of numbers they can come up with about some of these improvements.
As you suggested, maybe folks can follow up with the two of you who do more studies in that field. But turning to your report, and you did mention it is still important to count the toys that China has. What was the main finding of your report that looked at how China is using civilian landing craft?
Or some of the key findings that we determined over the course of writing the report was, first, that these essentially civilian but converted to military use landing craft, or LCTs, that they could offer the PLA a type of direct over-the-shore lift that could fill a gap between when the first echelon assault hits the beach and between that and when the PLA might be able to capture and use a Taiwanese port, or perhaps to erect floating piers or to put in place those Shuichao landing platforms we talked about. Using these LCTs on a beach could allow for also immediate support from non-swimming logistic elements of that first echelon, like trucks and heavier armored vehicles like tanks. Our next big finding was that even with what we thought was a pretty conservative estimate of the aggregate capacity of these LCTs, these landing craft, that indicates to us that these civilian platforms could provide a total over-the-shore lift capacity that is several times that of the PLA Navy's sum total of their landing ships, the kind they can land on beaches, like landing ship tanks, LSTs, or medium landing ships, LSMs. Lastly, it looks to us like this integration of LCTs into their beach landings and their practice of doing so just shows how the PLA is continuing to evolve and expand its amphibious capabilities at a pretty fast pace, on a timeline that seems to make sense for Xi Jinping's 2027 goal. It's just what looks to us like the latest innovation in their attempts to find the optimal combination of military and civilian capabilities to be able to make that sort of thing happen.
Thanks, Tom, for sharing the main findings of your report. So maybe we can take a step back. So what exactly is a landing craft tank? How big are they? Are they like railroads? What type of ships are they?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. And as we learned about what these things were when we saw them going onto the beach, it really kind of was an eye-opener to see where this all came from. So a bit of history, the military landing craft tank, or LCT, was first actually developed in World War II by the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, and the US Navy. What happened after the war was that in those post-war years, these surplus LCTs ended up in commercial use, particularly in China and in Southeast Asia. They were used to transport goods, heavy equipment, rocks, whatever, from island to island, especially when you didn't have a developed port. Because, being landing craft, they had the ability to lower, ramp, and deliver stuff straight to a beach. In the decades that followed the war, as those wartime vessels reached the end of their service lives, the regional shipbuilding industry, including in China, began building new ones to replace those that serve a similar function. So those ships, even though they are built technically for civilian shipping, and not only in China, they continue to be known as LCTs. You can see this in the civilian advertising on these shipyards. They're used mainly for transporting engineering equipment, rocks, ore, stone, sand, large trucks. Because of their military origin and origin as landing craft and a general design, they have a flat bottom, single deck. They're just one open deck, usually twin diesel engines, all rudders and propellers, and they're all protected. All those propellers and rudders are protected by bilge keels. And then, of course, there is a bow ramp for delivering materials and equipment ashore. In terms of advertised size, these LCTs, and you can read this stuff on the builders' websites, and then also you can just see it on their AIS data. In general, they're about 250 to 440 feet in length. They're about 75 to 135 meters. And they're about 50 to 90 feet wide, or about 15 to 30 meters. And they all have a shallow draft.
And so how do these LCTs differ from civilian roll-on, roll-off ships? Because there's been quite a bit of focus of these ro-ro ships, vessels, as ways that the Chinese military is working with civilian vessels to also deliver potential troops across the Taiwan Strait.
So fundamentally, I would say they're not different from the ro-ro ships that we've been seeing. Just to roll back a little bit, I've written quite a bit about roll-on, roll-off ferries in a series for the Naval War College called Fairy Tales. There are now 3 iterations of that. But in the last iteration of Fairy Tales, we saw LCTs along with what I was characterizing as large deck cargo ships. Again, one big flat deck. They could be used for containers. They could be used for rolling stock like trucks or tanks. They're also used in, again, large construction projects. These are the types of ships that would move, let's say, offshore wind farm equipment, to be constructed offshore. So these are big ships, and the LCTs were a part of those exercises. But what we saw in 2024 was they were being used just to go port to port and to transport trucks. They would load them in a port and then they would offload them to a port. The innovation this year was using these LCTs in direct beach landings, as Tom was describing.
I think that's probably the key difference between these and the other ro-ro ships that we've seen take part in exercises, is that those ferries, the roll and roll-off ferries and vehicle carriers that we've seen them use before exercises, those ships can't go to the beach. They're pretty deep draft. They can get relatively close to the shore, but they cannot go to the beach. And that's where the LCT really is different, that it can go right up on the beach and drop a ramp and deliver stuff straight onto the sand.
So how many of these LCTs have you found or identified? And why do you think the PLA is now turning to these civilian ships to fill some of the gaps in their amphibious lift capability?
So that number was a really important one to look at because, in my opinion, the biggest significance of this development is the number, in the sense the aggregate capacity that these ships could bring. So in order to figure that out, because that was a big question, was how many of these things are there? And the answer is there are a lot. So to try to figure out kind of a minimum number, using open source data on deck cargo ship production, combining that with an examination of commercial satellite imagery, we found at least 11 shipyards that appear to have produced these things in recent years, and especially in the last few years. And then looking at that imagery, which was from varying dates, this is whatever. We're looking at those shipyards and finding whatever is the latest image we can find, Google Earth, Planet Labs, whatnot. Looking at those 11 shipyards, we identified 125 LCTs of various sizes just at those shipyards, various dates. Looking a little deeper, including with the help of some of your folks there, Bonnie, at CSIS, your team helped us with data that indicated there are at least 152 currently PRC flagged deck cargo ships. Now, this is of all types. And then in China, regardless of the flag state, there's at least 252 deck cargo ships operated by Chinese-owned companies. Broadening the look a bit, looking at AIS vessel data, their automated information system. This is kind of the transponders that ships carry. Doing a search of Chinese flag shipping, I found that there's more than 1,800 shallow draft Chinese flag cargo ships of all types with dimensions that are similar to those of the most common LCT types. Look at, I think 125 that we counted as a bare minimum. That would only be about 7% of the total number of Chinese shallow draft cargo ships. And if you aggregate that together and just kind of do some rough math of the size of these things, we're estimating they could provide about 180,000 square meters of deck space. So what does that mean? It means most likely 3 brigades at a time per wave of the PLA's heaviest combined arms brigades. Comparing that then to the rest of the PLA Navy, that's about 6 times the total vehicle capacity of all of the PLA Navy's gray-painted, beachable ships like their LSTs and LSMs.
Well, Tom, that is an extraordinary number. And how does that then change your assessment of China's ability to engage in a large-scale amphibious assault? Because your report mentions the 2025 Department of War report on the Chinese military, where that DOW report noted that the PLA has not invested in the number of tank landing ships and medium landing ships, though the PLA has trained with civilian ro-ro ships. So from your perspective, how does this finding change our understanding?
Well, that's certainly, that's been a big question, right? So as you say, in the 2025 report on the Chinese military, the department that's kind of been an open question. That for some reason, they don't seem to have invested in the number of landing ships that would be required for an assault. It looks like this could be part of the explanation of that lack of investment, that maybe they found another way to do it. So I really do think that is an important thing to think about.
And this is not a new thing, Bonnie. Long time in naval intelligence. I tell people I'm a recovering intelligence officer, but 10, 15 years now, maybe longer than that. The intelligence community assessment was China doesn't have the amphibious lift that it needs to get across the strait. And yet, over the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen innovation upon innovation using civilian ships and leveraging some of these greater capacities that they have within their civilian fleet to provide just that amount of lift, this increase in capacity that may well be closing the perennial gap that we had identified so long ago.
And the two of you in your research have found significant evidence of LCTs either training with the PLA or at typical PLA beach landing sites, right?
Absolutely. We were able to identify those landing craft in imagery that was also reported in the media, reported in the press. But it was really Tom who, found the AIS data that put those, at that point, unidentified vessels on the beach at a known amphibious landing area in the southern theater. And then I was able to go back and look at some commercial satellite imagery, and lo and behold, there were those deck cargo ships that he had identified in AIS. We had those in imagery, and that really provided sort of the foundation of this report.
Yeah, it was a real surprise. Like, I was just looking at AIS data from, again, an exercise in July or August. I forget which one I saw first, but just kind of watching the where these ships were. And it's ships we'd seen before in other exercises. And all of a sudden, I noticed 3 of them go all the way to the beach. And it's like, that looks like a landing assault. Multiple ships going all the way to the beach and staying there for a relatively brief period of time, like it would take to unload some vehicles, and then immediately departing the beach. That was a real wake-up call. And then to go dig into who these ships were and figure out that it was a derivative of a landing craft design from World War II. That's quite something. The final surprise was then, once I figured out who builds these things and what they are, was to look at imagery. And anyone can go look at the Beijing shipyard. And we talk about that in the location in the report. And you can go count for yourself in an image from January of 2025 on Google Earth. It's something like 80 of these things in one picture.
And I think you've already suggested how these ships could be used in operations against Taiwan. But do you envision that these ships would be protected by other ships? I think you had mentioned earlier that they were just open decks, right? So they didn't have any capabilities attached to them. Or maybe, as Tom, you suggested, maybe these ships, if needed, could also be equipped with capabilities similar to the other civilian container ships that you've observed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of options they have to use these things. I mean, the thing we have to remember is that if you look at Chinese doctrine, they are quite clear that you don't even assemble the invasion force until they have seized complete air, naval, and information superiority. So the idea is not that these things are going to fight their way through anything to get to the beach. It's that they're going to be entering an already somewhat pacified environment where China has really seized the advantage. Think about D-Day of World War II. I mean, American ships and American, British, Canadian ships didn't fight their way across the English Channel. That area was already cleared for them when they came across. So these ships are relatively, they have no organic defenses. They're civilian vessels. They would be no doubt surrounded by escorts. Perhaps they could carry, mobile anti-air systems on board, just in the form of the units that they're transporting across. And let's not forget also, we just saw an amazing story in the New York Times where they looked at transponder data for Chinese fishing boats, and they saw them assemble thousands of these things, of these fishing boats, into organized lines, like an organized fleet that covered hundreds of miles. So these things could be surrounded by huge numbers of fishing boats that could be used as decoys. They could have radar reflectors on board, acoustic jammers, all the different things you need to make stuff not hit these things.
And can these ships be used in other operations against Taiwan that isn't amphibious assault? Could they be used in blockade or quarantine operations?
I wouldn't really look at them for anything like that. I think these are one-hit wonders. They're designed to carry things from point A to point B. This is immediately after that. They've pacified or at least neutralized a lot of the threats on the beach. And now the PLA needs to bring in spare parts and fuel and logistics personnel and medical personnel and all things that are maybe, as Tom said, not in swimming amphibious vehicles, but are just on 5-ton trucks that cannot swim and need to go to the beach and drive off of something like one of these LCTs.
Are there any other weaknesses or vulnerabilities of the LCT? Your report suggested that they could only operate and land on beaches during a very narrow window during high tide. Is that a vulnerability, for example, that Taiwan or the United States could exploit, in addition to the fact that they're not defended?
It's a physical reality I think the way these things generally are going to operate is they're going to come in at high tide where they can get up to where they can drop a ramp. And then as the tide goes out, they'll be there and maybe offload the vehicles. Although we also have seen occasions where, they really have come in and out relatively quickly. So they came in, dropped off did whatever they're going to do and turned around and left. So potentially, particularly given the mud flats that Taiwan has, in some cases, that may be somewhat limiting in some areas. I don't think that these open up any new areas other than what the PLA Navy could already access using its LSTs and LSMs. It just, I think, increases the capacity.
So as we're looking at what PLA planners are taking into account and this additional lift capacity from the LCTs, how does that, from your perspective, change, if anything, PLA's calculations or ability to execute an amphibious invasion of Taiwan?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things we're seeing happen that are what I would say are, if you ask me, what do I expect to happen for them to be ready to execute this mission by 2027, they're doing the kind of things that I would expect to do that. And sometimes there are surprises, quite frankly. So one of them was the Shuiqiao LPUs, seeing those go into production and be tested this year. I was surprised not to see those take part in any significant exercises this summer. So they have yet to be, I think, fully tested with the PLA in an exercise, which is something I would probably expect to see next year. But again, on a timeline that still could make sense for 2027. In terms of how does it change the logistics picture, I mean, it's all about that aggregate capacity, this really, really significant addition to the amount of capacity they have to bring things across the beach there in Taiwan. In terms of, what does it mean for that goal? Well, I mean, it just looks like another example of them increasing their capabilities to do that operation. I'd point out also that 2025 DoD report we talked about did make a pretty strong statement. PLA is making progress towards its goal, being able to achieve victory over Taiwan. And it also said that China expects to be able to fight, and this is quote, fight and win a war on Taiwan by the end of 2027. That report also said that China has been practicing components of all of its options to force unification, including strikes on U.S. forces in the Pacific that could challenge and disrupt them out to a couple thousand miles.
Not to dispute that at all, but just to add a little bit of optimism or maybe skepticism to the conversation. An amphibious invasion, if we're talking about the full meal deal, putting the PLA ashore, not just a blockade or a firepower strike or maybe a smaller amphibious operation against the Penghus in the center of the Taiwan Strait, it's still a high-risk operation, I think, for the PLA by 2027. Are they building out the capabilities and capacities to do that? It does appear that they are. But, as former military officers, I think Tom and I might agree that it's impressive what they're doing, augmenting their military force with civilian vessels. And it does provide them with that capacity. But the PLA has always been an organization, and the Communist Party even more so, has always been an organization with trust issues. And it's not even that you don't trust the civilian captains to not turn tail and run in the face of fire or something like that. It's a kind of trust where if you are the PLA and your job is to move fast and conduct a rapidly unfolding military operation that has to be highly synchronized, where everybody is in lockstep to do one thing after another, are you going to have enough professionalism and discipline within your civilian component to execute that type of operation? Because if you've ever seen a big amphibious operation, whether it's a historical example or just something from a more recent exercise, it's a traffic jam, near the beach. And if you have ships that are bumping into each other and people are not getting out of the way or people are not keeping on their timeline, it can be a huge mess. So I think one of the big questions is, and this is going to be really difficult to know from open source observations, is whether the PLA really trusts in this civilian component to deliver on those strict timelines if they decide to launch a large-scale operation.
To be clear, also, I'd like to add that while I was saying that the PLA is doing the kinds of things I would expect them to do to be ready to do something like that, that in no way means that they have chosen that they're planning to actually do so. I think the direction to the PLA has been to have the option to fight a war with Taiwan if directed. But one thing I would say, though, is that we often get a lot of discussion about, that's so risky, and it is, that China would be more likely to choose lower tier options like a blockade, quarantine, or missile bombardment. But I think it's worth considering that even those kind of lower end, certainly not gray zone, but those kind of lower end options have a lot more credibility if there is a credible threat of invasion behind them. If China invades with a blockade or quarantine, all that Taiwan has to do is not surrender. There's no PLA troops on the island. They just got to not give up. And if there's no sign that they're going to get invaded, then, or there any credible threat of that, then I think it could be a lot easier for them to hold out.
So I guess two follow-on questions on the point that you made, Mike, in terms of a question mark that we have right now is if the PLA trusts these civilian vessels to deliver. Have either of you seen any evidence that these civilian LCTs are operated by either former PLA, those who have been in the PLA, or current PLA officers or officials? And the other question I have, Tom, is in the scenario that you outlined in which these LCTs that don't have any defensive capabilities on them are operating after China has already seized air and sea dominance. It seems to me in that scenario, there's less of a concern of relying on these LCTs to engage in any complex operation. They're just merely delivering goods to Taiwan. So I guess I'm just a little bit confused on exactly what role these LCTs will play, or if there is also the possibility that these LCTs could play a role even when Taiwan Strait is so very contested.
To your question of, have we seen PLA or former PLA officers or naval personnel operating these LCTs? We really don't know. I don't have a roster of who used to be in the PLA years ago. We've seen videos or have had other open source reporting about how these types of ships are used. The roll-on, roll-off ferries and the other ships that Tom and I have looked at over the years are actually part of the maritime militia. We think of the maritime militia as being this fleet of thousands of fishing boats, the ones that Tom was talking about lining up in the East China Sea at the end of 2025 and the beginning of 2026. But there is another part of the maritime militia that is actually a logistics component that provides these cargo services and roll-on, roll-off transportation services to the PLA. And presumably, these LCTs would be part of that maritime militia. So they might get, the crews and the captain might get some basic training from the military. They might hold some rank or position within the militia force, and they may, they may act in that capacity as part of one of these operations. But that maritime militia force doesn't necessarily extend to every single LCT or deck cargo ship in the Chinese in the Chinese merchant inventory. It is probably a smaller subset of those overall numbers. And we just don't have any idea how many ships or crews that might be. The other thing I would say, and I'll let Tom answer the more substantive part of that question, not to confuse things, yes, the LCTs would come after that initial assault wave, but it doesn't mean that Taiwan forces would not still be resisting. It does not mean that the Americans or the Allies might not come in later and target these types of ships. Unless the PLA completely pacifies the island, there is still a chance that, there's going to be fog and friction on those beaches during the landing that LCT captains would have to contend with.
I'm going to have to give what I think is a fairly unsatisfying answer as to exactly how these things are going to be used and whether they are anticipated to deal with a contested environment, and that we just don't really know. I mean, we've seen a couple of exercises. What we can tell you is that it looks like we can see that they physically went to the beach as part of what was clearly a landing exercise that had other elements consistent with previous landing exercises where you had, for example, like we definitely know they were landing exercises because there was another larger traditional ro-ro, and we could see wakes of the amphibious assault vehicles going to and from the beach. So they were definitely taking part in a landing exercise. They definitely went to the beach. What we don't know is what was simulated at the time. Was there resistance that was simulated? Were they just making sure that they could do it? A lot of that remains unknown.
Great, thank you. Final question I have for the two of you is, given this development and identification of LCTs as potentially an additional capability that could help enhance China's amphibious lift, how can Taiwan and U.S. allies and partners respond to this?
What I've said before in testimony, and I think it still applies to this question, is I think it's important that Taiwan on its own, and then augmented by the United States, have in place on the island munitions in sufficient quantity that are dispersed and survivable on a day-to-day basis, that have the ability to pick out and strike platforms like these and the ferries that China could use, and to be able to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, given that there's going to be lots of decoys and all kinds of stuff out there in the strait, that they can really survive and strike these assets and others like them in a fairly choosy manner, so that they're delivering those effects in a realistic way. It could be in the form of drones that are human controlled, that are able to home in on the right targets. It could be in the form of weapon systems that have autonomy and that have image recognition, that can pick out vessels that look like the right kind that matter. So those are capabilities that I think are going to be really important. Minefields could, of course, be very helpful. And I would emphasize in this case that if Taiwan intends to count on minefields to defend itself from a PLA attack, those mines need to get laid now. Because one thing that I am quite confident in is that if Xi Jinping has made the decision to invade Taiwan, I don't think he's going to stand there and watch them lay the minefields that are going to stop them. So I think now is the time to put in place the defenses necessary to defend against a threat of this magnitude. And it's got to be on a day-to-day basis, dispersed, survivable, whatnot, because China is obsessed with striking by surprise. And if everything's stacked in warehouses, well, that's where it's going to stay.
Yeah, and I would say on this recent trip to Taiwan, I had the opportunity to talk to some entrepreneurs and folks that were working with a company called TT Robotics, which is just one example, I think, of many. But TT Robotics is a Taiwan company that is really taking a page out of the Ukraine playbook. And they have an automated factory, and they are scaling up to build thousands of drones. And I think at one point in our discussion, I said, well, what is your production capacity? And he said 4,000. And I was like, 4,000 drones a year. And he's like, no, 4,000 drones a month. Taiwan has gotten the memo on what needs to happen if the PLA begins swarming the island with, fishing boats and LCTs and gray hull ships and Coast Guard cutters. They need to come up with a proliferated response that can swarm back. And, I think with the vulnerabilities we talked about of the LCTs, with the open decks and things like that, you don't need to sink the ship as much as you just need to destroy the vehicles that are at the front of the ship so nothing else can get off.
Awesome. Thank you both very much for joining to share your new report of how you found these civilian vessels that are now able to transport more capabilities across the Taiwan Strait. I think, if I recall correctly, 6 times the capabilities that currently the PLA Navy is able to transport. And thank you also for sharing what you mentioned earlier, that there are actually a number of countermeasures that Taiwan and U.S. allies and partners can take.
Thanks, Bonnie. It was great to join you. And again, thank you again to your team at CSIS for providing some really valuable information that helped us to flesh out what that capability looks like.
Thanks. It's been a great conversation.